there, so Eric, I think you need to make out another check Tuesday. Of course, I haven't got this one yet. So. Anyway, today is Memorial Day, and it's a special day. It's a day that we honor particularly those that have served in the military. And of course, Ben, who is one of our veterans, this is his last Sunday here. Not his last Sunday, period. But he'll be leaving, and we're going to miss him. And memorial is a way of remembering people. In, Memorial Day for remembering our veterans, and also the first responders, the firemen, the policemen, the people that serve us in our communities. One that I'm particularly fond of, and I've been in the hospital a few times, as some of you have, and nurses. About a week and a half ago was National Nurses Day. And I think about the times that I was in the hospital, and I appreciate all the modern medical techniques and the medicine and the skill of the doctors and the other technicians, but there's nothing like a nurse, right? I mean, you're sick and you're weak and you're in the hospital, and God bless the nurses. So for all the first responders and for our veterans and the other people that we want to remember today, this is Memorial Day. And I'm thankful for those that served me and my community, and I know you are too. Memorial Day as a holiday is the last Monday in May. Some of you will know that there's also a Confederate Memorial Day that nobody remembers, but it's the last Monday in April. So that may be why they picked the last Monday in May. The first Memorial Day celebration was started by a bunch of women. Yeah. It was up in Waterloo, New York, and it was on May the 5th, 1871, a few years after the Civil War, and these women had lost loved ones, sons and husbands and brothers and all the rest in that tragic war where 620,000 men and some women lost their lives, and many others were seriously wounded. Some of these women's husbands and brothers and sons and fathers were still alive, but they were crippled, they were amputees, they were blinded. And the women said, we need to find some way of remembering them. You see, memorial is for remembering. In the Hebrew, in the Bible, the word memorial is the same root word as remember. It's when we celebrate communion here. Communion, Jesus said, when he passed out the bread and the drink at the Last Supper, he said, do this in remembrance of me, as a memorial to me. And in the Hebrew, that word remember has that idea that we bring back, we remember something. When something is dismembered, it's torn apart and forgotten. It's like a mist that disappeared. But when you remember, you remember something. You bring it back. And those of us that have lost loved ones, whether it's in a military situation or you've lost them car accident or old age or cancer or whatever, from time to time we remember our lost loved ones. And it does bring them back, doesn't it? In fact, sometimes when we remember someone that we've lost, well, you've experienced this, you can actually smell them, right? How many of us have smelled remember how they would comfort us or, hug us and cherish us, and that there was a distinctive smell. Well, in the Hebrew, the word that's used for memorial is actually the root word is for smell. It becomes so real that it's tangible. You can actually smell it. Well, these women, getting back to Waterloo, New York, they were remembering their husbands and fathers and sons that had been lost or wounded in that terrible Civil War. And they began to talk about it, and as women sometimes do, they made a great decision. They said, you know what we should do? We should have a picnic. And that's what they did. They said, we're going to have a picnic, and it was going to be on a Saturday. It was May the 5th, 1771. And it wasn't just women from Waterloo, New York. It was a gathering that had been sponsored by, I think, a church event, but there were women there from all over the country. There were women there from Georgia and Mississippi and Alabama and Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania. In other words, there were Yankee women and there were Confederate women, but they had one thing in common. They had lost loved ones, sons, husbands, brothers. Didn't make any difference what color their uniform was. And women have a unique capacity for compassion. They can reach out and embrace and touch one another in a very unique and powerful way. That's the real meaning of the word compassion. And women seem to have it more than us guys. But these women, they wanted to remember their sons and husbands and brothers. And so they decided to get together and have a picnic. Now, when women have a picnic, they have to do something first. What is that?
Cook.
They have to cook, right? And the recipes, you wouldn't believe it. I mean, there was some lady from Putney, Georgia, probably, that made a pecan pie. Well, that's what Yankees call it. It's actually a pecan pie. And there was some woman from Pennsylvania that made a wonderful green bean salad. And some other woman knew how to fix squash, and somebody else could cook potatoes. But before women, do that, they have to write down a recipe. And so not only did they bring all this delicious food to this gathering where they were remembering the ones they lost in the war, but they had this delicious food and the recipes. Well, Channel 10 was there to cover it. It actually wasn't Channel 10, it was a local newspaper. But you know what they did? They weren't going to miss a chance for publication, so they wrote down the recipes, and that was the first time that recipes were printed in a newspaper. Because the newspaper said, look what these ladies did. They got together to remember those that were lost in the war. And by the way, that's not important. The important thing is they had this delicious food, and here are the recipes. And people, back then there wasn't any internet, and so people would take their scissors and they'd cut the recipes out, and they'd send them to their, relatives in New Jersey and Arizona or wherever, and word spread because of those recipes. And people all over the country said, this is a marvelous idea. We ought to do this every year. We'll remember our war dead and our veterans that have been injured, and we'll call it Memorial Day. Well, it wasn't until years later, in 1971, that the U.S. Congress said, hey, that might be good for boats. Let's make it a holiday. So they made it a national holiday and said it would be the last Monday in May. And that's how Memorial Day kind of came about. But it is an important day for all of us. Now, even though I believe in brevity, and I did write down a couple of notes, I'd better look at them, yeah. I said the other day to Nancy, I said, you know, brevity is the heart of wit. And she said, well, actually, it's brevity is the soul of wit. And so I had learned after 20 years of being around her that my response should always be, oh yes, sweetheart, you're right about that. So I said that, but then secretly, I checked Google. And sure enough, she was right. So, it's brevity is the soul of wit, and it just means to be brief and concise and to the point. So I'll try to do that. I remember when I first started preaching in South Carolina, up in a place called Elgin, South Carolina. I was a Methodist minister, and I found out that all the ministers in the whole county preached for 45 minutes. I don't know why, they didn't have anything to say, but 45 minutes was typical. And I noticed that the Baptist church and the Pentecostal church and the Church of God and this church and that church, they all got out about 12:30 every Sunday morning. And I also noticed that the restaurants in town were packed at 12:30. Because when people got out of church, what did they do? They went to eat. And so they'd go to the restaurant, they'd have to stand in line, you know, and they'd all be quilled outside, and people would be calling the Montgomery family and the Wilson family and this and that. So I told my congregation, I said, you know, I can write a 45-minute sermon and deliver it every Sunday, or I can just, you know, talk for 5 or 6 minutes and hell, we'll go eat. They said that's a good idea. So let's go with brevity. Brevity is the soul of wit. So with that, I'll try to hurry up. Speaking of brevity and speaking of memorials and speaking of things, there's a thing we call a memorial stone or a tombstone. And I don't know, I've always been kind of interested in them. I like to go to cemeteries and look around. And when I was up there in South Carolina, I was privileged to pastor one of the oldest, most historical churches in the Southeast. And it was Smyrna United Methodist Church in Elgin, South Carolina. And the church had been open from way back in the 1700s, and there was an old cemetery there. And I used to like to go and look around because ministers don't really have anything to do. They can play golf on Mondays for free, but other than that, you preach on Sunday and you got to kill time somehow. So I'd go to the cemeteries and look around. And there were a bunch of old tombstones in there that were real interesting, dating all the way back to the 1700s. And these tombstones are memorial stones. They're there so that we can remember that person that passed away. And there was one in particular that I'll never forget because it was so well written. As a matter of fact, not only will I never forget it, but you'll never forget it either. If I come back here 50 years from now and they roll me in here in a wheelchair, you'll say the 4 words that were on this memorial stone because none of you will ever forget them, and so it'll serve its purpose. The guy that passed away was named Lester. And you know how it is on a lot of memorial stones where it'll be the first name, the middle name, the last name, the date of birth, the date of death, his first wife, his second wife, his third wife, all of his children's names, his grandchildren's names, what he did for a living, where he was in the military, all this stuff. Nobody cares about any of that, and we all forget it. A memorial stone is designed so you can remember, in this case, a guy named Lester. And when I tell you later what they wrote on his stone, you'll know why it's the best one I've ever seen. Why I'll never forget it, and you'll never forget it. But another type of memorial is like a speech. You know, we can make an address. How many of you have ever heard of the Gettysburg Address?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Most of you memorized it when you were, in the 3rd or 4th grade. And the Gettysburg Address was to memorialize again those who had passed away in the Civil War. And you'll probably remember uh, the words of the Gettysburg Address that began, "Standing beneath this serene sky." That doesn't sound right. That Gettysburg Address was written by a senator, Edward Everett. It was 14,320 words long. It took 3.5 hours for him to read it. So it wasn't brief. There was another guy that gave an address that day. He was not a senator, he was the president, Abraham Lincoln. He didn't have a 14,420 word address. He was on a train riding to Gettysburg, and he said, you know, the people are going to want to hear something. He looked around, he found a pen. He looked around, he found a napkin. It was actually the napkin that he had been served coffee with earlier on the train. And he began to scribble down some words. He actually wrote down 227 words. It took him 3 minutes to give the Gettysburg Address that begins 7 years ago, our forefathers, etc., etc. It's the one we all remember. So that says something about brevity. Abraham Lincoln did the right thing. He was trying to unite and bring the country together, and the Gettysburg Address did just that. Senator Everett, most of you didn't even know there was such a thing, did you? So that shows how memorialized, he was. To memorialize something is important, and to remember our loved ones is important, and we can make it so real that they actually exist again. 40 years ago, I lost a child, a daughter. I had never actually met her. I hate to admit it, but she was aborted. And I'm ashamed of that, but her name is Shannon Elizabeth, and I love her dearly. And sometimes I remember her, and she becomes so real to me that I can smell her, that little baby girl, and I love her dearly. And I know last week, Joel told us that we disappear when we die. I don't believe that. And I told him, I said, Joel, I really enjoyed your sermon. I don't believe anything you said. You can still have your check. But Shannon Elizabeth is real to me. And your loved ones that you remember are real to you, whether they were military or otherwise. It may even be somebody in your experience that isn't even dead, they just left. Like Ben's leaving, but we'll remember you, Ben. we'll memorialize Ben. But it is important that we remember. And so I'll come back to Lester. I was in that cemetery up there in South Carolina. I was looking at the old memorial stones, and there was one in the back, kind of in the weeds actually. It was from the 1700s, so it had turned black with mold, and it was bent over and leaning over. It was just about falling down, but I went over there and I was able to look and squint, and I could make out the words. His family had written on that stone, no less, no more. I'll never forget it. I'll remember Les forever. And that's the idea. So I hope you'll remember Les too. No less, no more. And with that, we'll close. Father, we thank you that we've been able to gather together here today. And we thank you for those that have been in our lives and have touched our lives and have gone on for whatever reason and by whatever means. We can remember them, and we can remember you. And in the difficult times in our life when we need a friend, we can remember you and allow you to be a part of our experience every day. And for that we give you thanks. Amen.